Hi, I would like to read you the story of the great tales from long ago, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. I'll have to figure out which way to turn it. There we go. This book belonged to Betty Jo Coleman. It has a copyright of 1985. So it's written by Jan Gleiter and Kathleen Thompson, illustrated by Yoshi Makak. Close as I can come to it. Paul Bunyan was big. That's the first thing that anyone should know about him. He was very, very big. Nobody knows exactly how big he was, but there are some stories. So here we have Paul Bunyan, and then there is his parents down there. They said when he was a baby, Paul was too big to stay in the house, so his father had to cut down tall trees to make a boat. His mother made a blanket as big as a football field. Then they put the boat on a river and tucked in Paul. The waves rocked him to sleep. Here's the mama tucking him in with his blanket and the daddy that had cut all the trees down. But in a lot of ways, Paul was like any other baby. When he woke up, he wanted to play. He laughed and he rolled around in his boat bed. And when Paul rolled, the boat made a wave taller than a house. And then it made a wave taller than two houses. The waves smashed onto the shore. Then it made a wave taller than two houses. I may have said that. Okay. People on the land had to climb onto the roofs of their houses. They went up into trees. Some of them had to climb up the church steeple. So there he is climbing way up to the top there so that the waves didn't get them. Must have been a little bit scary. Well, after that, Paul's mother and father were more careful. As he grew up, they taught him many things. They had to tell him, don't step on farms, don't lean on small mountains. They also taught him to use an axe, and that was what Paul really loved. There were lots of trees to cut down in those days. America was covered with forests. People needed trees to make houses and farms and to help build railroads. So it looks like Paul's daddy is showing him how to split a piece of wood with his axe there. They have a dog there also. Nobody could cut down trees like Paul Bunyan. He would swing his shiny axe, and trees fell like toothpicks. He could cut down a whole forest before lunch and another one before dinner. Paul liked his life as a logger, but he needed a friend. He was lonely for someone his own size. Then came the winter of the blue snow. I wonder who else might be having a blue snow because it's so cold. There they are with the blue snow there. That winter, snow fell over all the land, and the snow was as blue as the sky. No, it was bluer than that. It was as blue ink. It came down in big blue flakes. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. One day, Paul was out walking in the blue snow. He was being very careful not to step on the snow-covered trees. And then he saw a small blue mountain that he hadn't seen before. As he got closer, the mountain moved. Snow started to fall from the mountain, and Paul saw two huge horns. And I see an eye peeking out there, too. The mountain turned out to be an ox as blue as the snow and almost as big as Paul. Paul named the ox Babe. Babe the blue ox stayed with Paul all of his life and was his best friend. Once Paul measured from one of Babe's eyes to the other. They were exactly 27 axe handles and a plug of tobacco apart. Just one of Babe's iron shoes was so heavy that a man who tried to carry it would sink into the ground all the way up to his belt. If Paul could cut down a forest in one morning, then Babe could carry it on his back. So here are all the trees that they've cut down. There are their helpers down there. They look pleased too. When Paul grew up, he had his own logging camp. He had a bookkeeper named Johnny Inkslinger and two cooks named Sourdough Sam and Hot Biscuit Slim. And he hired hundreds of loggers. One was named Hals Halverson. He was almost as big as Paul. Well, Sourdough Sam and Hot Biscuit Slim used a griddle as big as an ice skating ring, and every time they wanted to grease it, a dozen loggers strapped big hunks of bacon to their feet and skated on it until it was ready. And then the cooks would mix up a few hundred tons of pancake batter. When they poured it on the griddle, pancakes could be smelled from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. The cooks always made an extra train card load for Babe. I guess Babe liked pancakes too. One of Paul's biggest jobs was in North Dakota. Back then, there wasn't an inch of land in North Dakota that wasn't covered with trees. And people wanted farms. So Paul said that he would clear the whole state. He made the biggest logging camp that the world had ever seen. Every building in the camp was as big as a town. The dining room was so big that the loggers would get hungry just waiting in line for their food. So Paul built lunch counters every mile or so. That way the loggers could have their snacks while they were waiting for their meals. That's a lot of waiting. Babe and Paul Paul and Babe carried water to the camp from the Great Lakes. Paul put a big tank on Babe's back and filled it. As Babe walked to North Dakota, his hoof prints made holes in the ground. The water splashing from the tank filled the holes. That's why there are so many lakes in Minnesota. Once, Babe tripped, and all of the water spilled from the tank and started the Mississippi River. It didn't take long for Paul and Hals and the other loggers to cut down all the trees in North Dakota. But then there was a problem. There were tree stumps every few feet across the entire state. Farms can't have tree stumps on the land. Hals, Paul said to his friend, you and I have some work to do. The two of them walked all over the state of North Dakota, and every time they saw a tree stump, they used their big fist to pound it into the ground. In a week, they had pounded down every single stump. Paul wanted to find out just how good the land was for farming, so he planted a kernel of corn. Before he could turn around and walk away, the corn started growing. It grew so fast that pretty soon the top of the stalk couldn't be seen. Hal, said Paul, you climb up that corn stalk and cut off the top so it won't poke a hole in the sky. Well, Hal started climbing, but the corn was growing faster than Hal's could climb. In just a minute, Hal's was out of sight too. Paul yelled at him to come down. It took an hour for Hal's voice to reach the ground. I'm trying, but the corn's going up faster than I can come down, and I'm getting hungry. What will happen? So Paul loaded up a big shotgun with biscuits and shot him to Hal's so he wouldn't starve to death. And then Paul grabbed a bunch of rails from the logging railroad and tied them around the corn stalk as if he were tying a ribbon. The stalk kept on growing taller and wider, but the rails cut into it. In a few minutes, the corn stalk cut itself in half where the rails were tied. The stalk was so tall that it took 3 days for all of it to fall. When it got close to the ground, Hal jumped off. Well, said Paul, I guess the land is good enough for the farmers. So I'm finished here. Paul said goodbye to all of his friends in the camp and started to look for more trees to cut. He took Babe with him. There they go. Once, as they were walking, Paul was careless. He let his axe drag behind him and it dug out the ground to form the Grand Canyon. When Paul was in California, he chopped down redwood trees. They were really big in those days. In fact, it used to rain every time a cloud bumped into a redwood. Some people say that Paul and Babe ended up in Alaska. Maybe they did. If so, Paul probably still swings his big axe and Babe is walking right beside him. There they are walking together. And that's the end of that story. I hope you enjoyed the story about Paul Bunyan and Babe, the blue ox.